Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. Alright, so for many years we've not known the story of what happens before the great conflict led by Malefor within the Legend of Spyro timeline. We don't know many of the individuals, the civilizations, or the feats of this age, but with various story crafters telling of this age, I think that there is a desire to dive deeper into it, and so we'll be doing that today. So, where do we start? Spyro hasn't been born yet. The Terror of the Skies hasn't even been heard of. And the Purple Dragon? That's only ever been hearsay by this point. And even so, it's only an egg. So where are we? Well, the world at this point was abundant with dragons, reaching to distant lands, and already establishing themselves as the dominant species of this world. At the head of it all were the Elder Dragons, a council much similar to that of the Guardians. But even with their power, they still had allies. Those would seemingly be from the sightings within Old Warfang. The cheetahs of Avalar and the moles would be depicted alongside the dragons in a mural that depicted Malefor. The moles, in fact, were the ones who built the city of Warfang for the dragons, as a gift and representation of their relations. But there was another species in this world that despised the dragons, one who sought power over them, known as the apes. We don't know if there was any sort of conflict between the apes and the dragons, or if it was just a hatred between them, but maybe both were true. Now, back to Warfang. Life might have been what you expect from a flourishing city. From what we've seen, it appears to have been well kept, and it even held into the far future. So perhaps civilian life within the city wasn't so bad, as it seemed pretty fortified and well taken care of. But this is on the mainland. What about other parts of the world? Well, we know of a few places. The Shattered Vale, Dante's Freezer, Tall Plains, Munitions Forge, and Concurrent Skies seem to have all been dragon-inhabited lands at one point or another. The Shattered Vale hosted a few different locations. One in fact would be used by the Guardians later, and Spyro much later. The Dragon Temple. It wasn't the only structure out there, far from it in fact, but it was the only one that we really know anything about. Now, this temple resides in what we generally know as the swamp. Other structures are visible in this area, like I said, and they could be housing, storage, or, well, regardless, they've been long since abandoned by their original inhabitants. We don't know what the official name is for this swamp, but we do know that a silver river runs through it, and all the way down to a place known as the Ancient Grove. I talked about that if you're interested in learning more. I'll leave it in the description or in the top right corner of the video right now, or whatever other storytellers say. Beyond the Shattered Vale, Dante's Freezer lies, and this is an interesting one, as we later hear from the accounts of Jared Pollan that this land was later owned by a dragon named Cyril, one who Spyro would know as the Ice Guardian. Cyril would have held onto this land for many years, and speaks of a lineage he was a part of, one that he's proud to be in, and proud to boast about. Maybe this lineage dates back to before even Malefor, which could imply that his lineage had held dominion over this land for generations. As some might know, there were species that resided in many of these places that weren't dragons. The ogres, as we know them now, resided in Dante's Freezer, while in a location called Tall Plains, a more lush area, we have the Atalawa, a once prideful and tribal race. Moving on, we reach Concurrent Skies, and this area would be said to be a place of research and solitude for electricity dragons. It's said that even the Electricity Guardian Voltaire would visit this place many years later. They would manage the lightning that plagued the area, redirecting it and generally keeping everything in order. Now, it might be interesting to theorize that these areas are the origins of each of the different dragons, and whether or not that's true is up for you to decide. But I do think it would be interesting if these areas were, and thus when the dragons expanded, they always kept hold of their ancestral lands to hone their elements, while having a seat of power in Warfang. Overall though, the dragons seem to be united as one race, not really opposed to each other or really in conflict with one another, at least not in war. The internal politics of this time are known, so we're not sure about any real power struggle within the dragon race. I imagine that with what we talked about with Cyril and his lineage, that families or other dragons did run various locations around the dragon realms, given how each element is represented in this council that the elders form. There are some interesting things to bring up about different kinds of dragons. We've talked about wind dragons and water dragons here before. Now, we only ever see and hear of the wind element twice, with Malefor learning it and Cinder, well, just having it. Water, on the other hand, was only ever mentioned when it was pointed out that Spyro was once going to be the water guardian, not the ice guardian. But let's assume that these elements exist and fit into the world. How would they fit alongside the other dragons? Maybe they have their own areas they control and practice in, and have their own way of doing things. Or maybe they go alongside and train with the other dragons in their areas. Though personally, I think it would be neat to see water and wind dragons have their own specialized areas that they might train in. But that's just speculation on my part. So, as we can see, the dragons were pretty well spread out. But as for their culture, we unfortunately don't know too much. We do know at least that in their higher society, and maybe lower society, but we never actually see that, they would wear a sort of ornate attire. Ironically, some even having the Aether Crest engraved onto them, like a shoulder pad or maybe even an amulet. Whether the power of Aether was discovered at this point isn't known, but it sure seems that it influenced the attire of dragons before even the purple dragon, and, well, the discovery that the purple dragon could harness Aether. Maybe they did know about it, and given the pure nature of Aether, it being more of an ethereal magic, it could have been held up as a symbol of elemental purity, and maybe that's just part of their culture. If any wars prior to this had happened, we can't tell, as there's no records to say that there even was. But it's definitely implied that dragon history is much longer than we're ever shown. It could go back thousands of years, but we can't ever tell. The only individual who might know is the chronicler, who just so happens to keep most of dragon history kept in a library and doesn't share it nor really say anything beyond stuff we've yet to talk about. Anyway, speaking of the chronicler, we actually see him alongside the elders, and at this point, I believe, a teen Malefor, in some sort of temple, assumingly in Warfang. In fact, the same temple that some believe he would use as a throne years later, when he would face Spyro and Cinder. This also gives us a good view of the city, along with other views into how the city looked, and does give us a general idea of what the architecture of the dragons looked like. And this is kind of the reason why we think that it's Warfang, because it just seems so similar. In these we also see large statues, guards of sorts. These sorts of weapons and armor they were using were used greatly throughout the wars fought by the dragons, as we see them all the way back during this time. By the time of Spyro, we actually see them used with minimal changes to their designs. Armor seems much the same, and the symbolism used in their armor stays pretty consistent throughout the years, only perhaps changing rarely. Speaking of armor, the military. Something the dragons, I imagine, would have had. So, obviously, the military would have multiple roles, including scouts, soldiers, you name it. We do see roles mentioned, both in Jared Pohl and headcanon and in the accounts that we see from other sources. These being things like banner bearers, or if you want to go with Jared Pohl and headcanon, dragon knights. The history of something like this might actually make a good topic for another time. Moving on from the military, given how the dragons seem to have a good amount of power, civilian life, like I said earlier, might have been pretty good. No threat of attack with fortified cities, armies to defend you, and generally, this would be a time where young dragons were relatively safe. Perhaps these dragons, like Spyro much later, would train within the temples scattered around the world. For example, perhaps a young dragon would be trained within the Temple of Warfang. Maybe some would be trained in far-off lands like Concurrent Skies, or other places I referenced. Training might be done in groups, or with other dragons, maybe even in some arenas like the Dragon Dojo from the Swamp Temple. Each one would help to train them not only to fight, but also to train them in their element and allow them to understand it better. The elements are a big part of them. It's part of what they are, and as such, I imagine the study of them would be extremely important to dragons, both young and old. Jobs might be what you expect, like bakers, armorsmiths, and so on. If you wish to explore this in your own speculation, feel free to do that. I'd like to see what you all can come up with. I'm honestly sorry I can't really say much else, as honestly there isn't much to go off of. Maybe they get certain equipment from other species, or some sort of trade. Maybe the men were smalls from munitions forge, or something of that matter, make armor for them, or just give them steel. However, I do think that the dragons would produce a lot of their own things. As well, the dragons are definitely very different from the other species, so having some domestic produce would probably be better for them. As well, they would probably know what suits them best. Now, a lot of what I've said here is trying to mix a lot of the facts with my own speculation and tie it all together, just to give a glimpse into what this world might have looked like. The big thing is, though, the lack of the prophecy of the purple dragon. It wouldn't be something that would be conceived until later, more toward the age of Spyro, which leads us to the next part of this age, moving forward a few years, when Malefor hatches, or when he's starting to be trained by the elders. Now, when the elders found him, or were given him, I don't know what happened. Honestly, no one knew what he was, other than the fact he was obviously a dragon. We do know, though, as he grew older, he seemed to get stranger and stranger. As the legend goes, Malefor masters fire, and the other elements, including ones that Spyro didn't even learn, like wind. Which, given the fact that the Guardians are the ones to teach Spyro his elements, perhaps there might have been a wind guardian of sorts, or perhaps some teacher who knew the power of wind. But I digress. Overall, though, he wasn't a dragon that belonged to any of these elements, yet could use all of them. But alas, he was raised by the elders, given ceremonial garb, and passed down elemental secrets. The reception to him could have been all sorts of things, but given this mural I mentioned earlier in Old Warfang, and even a statue within the swamp temple of him, it seems that the alliance of moles, cheetahs, and especially the dragons held him in high regard, as a sort of hero by the looks of it. Now this brings us to an interesting point. The prophecy of the purple dragon, one that says that there will be a purple dragon born once every 10 generations. Now, when this was originally written, we don't know. We don't even know who wrote it, or who saw any of that to come, but that plays into the story later on when we finally meet Spyro. This leaves us with one way to go, forward. Malefor's subsequent fall to darkness, and the war he would bring. In the future, maybe we can get into what we know about that, and the events that transpired. But for now, that will be all. Now, I will say that there is a comic I've been reading from Dragon of Ice and Fire, actually, known as Destiny Intertwined. It delves into this period, and I think it's worth a read if you're interested in this era. It goes further into detail as it's building its own version of the past with some of its own rules, heavily drawing from both canon and Jared Polin headcanon. If you wish to read it or support it, I'll leave some links in the description below. Anyhow, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to the Patreons who are giving me red gems, Jabby, Shaggy, and Abyssal Blue, and thank you for the blue gems, Kiasu Shin, and Ecker Restored. If you wish to go and support me on there, 1, I will gladly appreciate it, and 2, I've actually gotten it set up so that you will be able to see early videos, and maybe scripts. I'm still working this out, but I do have some Patreon exclusive content now. Obviously, you don't have to do this. It does help to pay for my editing software, because Adobe, and it's very expensive. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. I'll see you all the next time we talk about lore or speculation. Stay safe, historians.